Okay, all set. Okay, good morning. So this morning I'm going to try to address the topic of what are the sources of conflict in human relationship as it is viewed or understood in the teachings of Krishnamurti. And I have to begin by saying that, I approach this role, this responsibility, with a little bit of trepidation for several reasons. One of them is that, here we are in the Krishnamurti library with the bookstore and the audio and videotapes and, this mountain of original material. And in the midst of all this, I'm going to tell you, what Krishnamurti has to say. It's a little bit as if we were on the banks of a large lake and someone was thirsty and I offered them a cup of water from the lake. It's not clear, what I could possibly have to offer that you could not get yourself from the lake. And then secondly, another reason for my sense of hesitation is that, Krishnamurti was very strong. He was adamant that he did not want anyone during his lifetime or after his lifetime to serve as any sort of interpreter of the teachings. He said many times, he didn't want any interpretation. He wanted the teachings to speak for themselves, and he felt they did speak for themselves. So, I have to emphasize that, part of his concern was that he didn't want anyone to assume a position of authority with respect to the teachings, as if someone would come along and say, I'm going to tell you what the teachings really mean. And so I just want to emphasize that I'm not doing that. My role is, I'm just a fellow explorer and sharing with you some of what I have discovered in my life and in my study of the teachings. And then there's even a third reason why I hesitate a little bit to assume this role, and that is that, another major point in the teachings was Krishnamurti was pretty adamant that he didn't want his teachings to be understood just on a conceptual or analytical basis. And, we just have to acknowledge that what I'm going to share with you is really a form of knowledge. There's no getting around that fact. We just have to recognize that what I have to contribute is a kind of conceptual analysis, and we have to take it for what it is. So with all these reasons to be hesitant, you might wonder, well, why did I agree to assume this responsibility? And, the way I look at it is that if you want to, say you wanted to understand the nation of France, it's understood you would have to go to France and see it for yourself, but you might also find that it was of some benefit to have a map of the territory, might come in handy, and it might also be useful to talk with someone who had visited France and spent some time there and get their impressions. And so it's kind of in that spirit that I am going to talk and try to convey a little bit, a kind of map of the teachings, and also share a little bit of my personal encounters and understanding of having studied the teachings for many years. So I'd kind of like to begin with a story of something that happened here in this house about 32 years ago. It was at the very beginning of 1986, and Krishnamurti had just come back from India. He was very ill, and very shortly after he arrived here, it was determined that he was suffering from cancer of the pancreas, and it was inoperable. So he spent his last month or so here in this house, in his bedroom. And during that time, I was serving as director of the Oak Grove School, and I was living with my wife in the upstairs apartment of the building that is now called Pepper Tree Retreat. And during that month or so that he was confined here to the house, I used to come and try to whenever I had the opportunity, kind of sneak into the house and tiptoe into his bedroom and see if he was awake and alone, and if I could talk with him for a few minutes. And on one of those occasions that I had that opportunity, I asked him, sir, why is it that you have spent your lifetime giving public talks, and it seems that nobody really has understood your work fully? It wasn't just my view, it was his view that that was the case. And he said, it's because no one has really taken in the teachings entirely. And I said, well, do you mean that nobody has taken in the totality of the teachings? Or do you mean that no one has taken it into themselves completely? And he said, both. And so I just wanted to mention that because even though I think it's very worthwhile and important to spend, 3 days discussing a very important topic like relationship, it's also worth remembering that that's just one avenue, one approach to understanding the teachings. And Krishnamurti felt it was very important to look at the teachings in their entirety, not just take one kind of a slice or section of it. So, in trying to understand what are the sources of conflict in human relationship, I think it would be good to begin by pointing out that Krishnamurti said that all of life is relationship. He said, to be is to be related. And if you think about it a little bit, that's kind of an interesting and unusual thing to say, because I think most of us kind of have the assumption implicitly that we exist as individuals, as a personality, independently of whatever our relationship is. We exist, and because we exist, therefore we can enter into relationship or not, what have you. But according to Krishnamurti, that's really not the case. That's a kind of illusion. He says the reality is that our whole being only exists in terms of the relationship itself. And if you remove all the relationships from you, there's no you left. The idea that there's a you independently of what you're related to is an illusion. And so that's really kind of a deep and unusual thing to say. But that's why he said that relationship is the mirror in which you can understand yourself, because his philosophy is oriented around self-understanding, self-knowledge. And he said relationship is a mirror in which you can understand yourself. And kind of the point of that is that we might assume that there's half a dozen or a dozen different modes or avenues towards self-understanding, but in a way, Krishnamurti seems to be saying, no, there's really only one way to understand yourself, and that is through the mirror of a relationship, because you don't exist apart from relationship. To be is to be related. So that raises the question then of, what is there to be related with? And according to Krishnamurti, relationship is with people, and with things, and with ideas. And he said this quite a few times, actually, and when he made this little list, it always strikes me as a little bit strange that he neglected to include relationship with nature in that list. That seems to me a little odd, because nature is very, very important to Krishnamurti personally, and it has its important place in the teachings, but for whatever reason, he didn't usually include nature when he made this little list, but we're going to come to relationship with nature later. And so today, we want to focus mainly on human relationship and the problem of conflict in human relationship, but we don't want to overlook entirely relationship with things and with ideas, not only because they're important in and of themselves, but also because they interact, and these areas of life, they kind of blend with one another. For example, we like to be wealthy, to have many things, but we don't want just to be wealthy. We also want to show off our wealth and let people know what a big house we have and an attractive car and jewelry. So there's a relationship between our relationship with things and with people there. And similarly, we have ideas also about things, about property. Some of these ideas are built up into a very elaborate way that we call ideologies, which are like communism and capitalism, which are really just complicated sets of ideas about things, about property. But these ideas are so important to us that they become the basis for something that we're willing to fight and kill and die for. So there's another case where things and ideas are in close relationship with one another. So I want to talk a little bit before we go into human relationship about our relationships with things and ideas. So with respect to things, most of our concern has to do with what we can possess, with either what we do possess or what we would like to possess, which for many of us is more or less unlimited. And so possession, which in and of itself is a practical matter and a legal matter, it gets mixed up with psychological things. It gets mixed up with our desire to possess and our sense of greed, which is wanting to possess more than we need, and our psychological sense of attachment to the things that we possess, which means that it has greater meaning to us than the actual practical value that it has. So, and then once the principle gets established that we can possess things, then that also kind of bleeds over into our possession of people and ideas, because we admire someone who we think possesses a great deal of knowledge, and we feel proud if we ourselves acquire some new information, new ideas. And similarly, if a person becomes very important to us, then we want to possess that person, and that can begin and most often manifests in wanting to possess that person psychologically, but of course the more extreme form of that is to actual physical possession of a person, which is slavery, which is obviously one of the most destructive and immoral forms of behavior. And today it's commonly understood that slavery is a deeply immoral thing, but it still exists, very widely in some parts of the world. And somewhat similarly, the way we treat animals is based on treating them as things. The way we raise and slaughter pigs and cows and chickens and so on is tremendously immoral and exploitative. And you might say that, well, we need animals for food, but that's a debatable proposition. And in any case, the way we treat animals, raise them and slaughter them, is horrifically immoral and destructive, and it's all based upon treating animals as things, as our property to do with as we like. And in any case, that's one of the reasons, I think, why all of the Krishnamurti schools are vegetarian. So, to be is to be related, and relationship is with people and things and ideas. And so we've talked a little bit about relationship with things, but we also need to go into relationship with ideas before we talk about people, because when Krishnamurti refers to relationship with ideas, I think what he means by ideas, he casts a very wide net. That term, the way he uses it, encompasses really, I think, everything in consciousness that is at all abstract or conceptual It includes all of our knowledge and really memory. And in essence, what Krishnamurti means by ideas is thought, is everything to do with thought. And at this point, when we get to the subject of thought, we've come very close to the core of Krishnamurti's philosophy, because he's very often regarded as a spiritual teacher and as a religious philosopher. And I don't want to deny that or argue against it, but I would like to say that the actual vast majority of the substance of the teachings just has to do with a very factual description of everyday human consciousness, and has very little to do with what we commonly think of or associate with religion, such as faith, belief in a god, or belief in some kind of afterlife or holy scriptures. So in a sense, I think we could say that the vast majority of Krishnamurti's teachings are what we could call secular descriptions of everyday consciousness. And in the landscape of human consciousness, according to Krishnamurti, really nothing looms larger or more significant than thought. In one of his dialogues with David Bohm, Krishnamurti raises the question, at least in life as we live it now, what is the most prominent feature of consciousness? And Krishnamurti says, obviously, it is thought. And he even goes on to say that he raises the question with Bohm, why is it that we have enthroned thought? He uses that word. Why have we enthroned thought and given it such supreme importance? And so a great deal of Krishnamurti's philosophy is dedicated to exploring the nature and the meaning of thought. And I think that it would even be possible to say that Krishnamurti is a philosopher of thought, of the nature and meaning of thought. It might not seem that way at first, but over the course of the last year, I've gathered together quite a few statements that Krishnamurti has made about thought, and I'd like to share them with you. I don't think I probably need to read these out loud, but I would just say that, of course, Krishnamurti would never present these observations in this manner. He would just come across any given one of these in the course of a much larger exposition, and he would take any one of these and elaborate at length upon its meaning. And so, my extracting these things out of context and isolating them and putting them all together presents them in a form which is very unlike the way he would have done it, but at the same time I think it's interesting to draw them together and show them as a collection and give you kind of a distilled sense of the rather remarkable list and variety of unusual things that Krishnamurti had to say about thought. I'll just make a couple brief comments about these last ones here. Thought is deviation is a thing that I've only run across once, and it was not in one of the public talks. It was something that was reported in Mary Zimbalist's memoir. So it doesn't quite have the same, total authenticity as the other things. Also, I put thought is a system, or thought as a system, last, and I put it in brackets because that's not something Krishnamurti said. It's something that David Bohm said, but I think it's a direct reflection. It comes directly from the teachings. Did you want to ask something?
Yes, may I see the first two screens of the list?
The first two screens? So, so we've said that to be is to be related, and that relationship is with people and things and ideas. And we've examined briefly, what Krishnamurti has to say about things and about ideas, understanding that by ideas he means to include all of thought. And so now I think it's time to turn our attention to people, relationship with human beings, and see what Krishnamurti has to say about that. So I think the first thing that I want to raise with respect to Krishnamurti's view of human beings is this statement that he made very often. It really is one of the quintessential core statements in all of the teachings. You are the world. And it has a great deal of depth, and rather than try to express in my words what that means, I'd like to read a passage from one of the talks where Krishnamurti expresses this, so you get it in his own words. This is from a talk that he gave in Madras. It was the first public talk that he gave in Madras in December of 1976. And I'm going to read a passage that is an excerpt from that talk. But just as a little footnote, I wanted to point out that when I was looking at this talk, I saw something I thought was a little curious. The very first thing he says when he begins is he says, "I hope you are not as nervous as I am." And I thought that was kind of curious because I don't recall Krishnamurti ever acknowledging that he was nervous when he started one of his talks, but that's how he started this one. Anyway, later on in the talk, he says this. So, when one goes around the world, America, Europe, in different parts of Europe, and come to this country, that would be India, one finds that human beings, whether black, brown, or yellow, or purple, whatever color you like, are almost the same. They suffer, they're confused, they're uncertain, they're seeking jobs, some kind of security, both physically as well as psychologically. So wherever you go, human beings are almost the same. They may have cultural, superficial differences, but inwardly, psychologically, they are essentially the same. So you are the world, and the world is you, right? Listen to it carefully. We're not saying agree or disagree. Find out. You suffer, don't you? You are uncertain. You are confused. So basically, if you look around, not only your neighbor, but at the world, whether the East or the West, communist or not communist, Catholic, Buddhist, Hindu, they all go through this mill, hunting for a job, working endlessly to survive, and in the process of survival go through great anxieties, fears, uncertainties, escape from their daily life into some form of religious nonsense with their rituals, gurus, priests, and endless temples and statues. This is happening all over the world, this human being, the human heart, the human mind. So you are the world, whether you like it or not, and the world is you. This is a fact. And your consciousness is the consciousness of humanity. You understand? The content in this consciousness is put together by thought as fear, as pleasure, all the different forms of pleasure and fear, the lack of relationship, the sorrows, the pains. All that is your consciousness, the content. And this consciousness is the consciousness of every human being in the world. So, against this background, I'd like to examine three issues that arise in human relationship and see how Krishnamurti examines each one of them. And these are the issues of attachment and comparison and identification. And I think if we explore these issues separately and also in combination, we can get a sense of how Krishnamurti views the issue of relationship and conflict in human relationship. But before we go into these three issues in some detail, there's one more point I'd like to make. And there's a principle in Krishnamurti's teachings that I'd like to highlight as a theme that runs through all of three of these issues. And if you examine the totality of the teachings, I think you'll find that there are very, very few things that Krishnamurti is so emphatic about that he would refer to it as a law, like one of the laws of Newton or the law of gravity. But there is one principle that he does repeatedly call a law. And, you might have heard of Murphy's Law, which says that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And there's something called Moore's Law having to do with computer technology, which says that processing power will double every 2 years. So kind of in the same spirit, I'm going to describe what I call Krishnamurti's Law. He didn't use that phrase, but I'm going to. Krishnamurti's Law, which states that wherever there is division, psychological division, there must be conflict. And again, here this principle is so basic that I don't want to just describe it in my own words, but read to you how Krishnamurti described this principle. So this excerpt is from Sonnen, 1985. This is from the first public talk in Sonnen that year. He said, "Have you ever noticed that we build a fence around ourselves, a fence of self-protection, a fence to ward off any hurts, a barrier between you and the other, between you and the family, and so on? There's a barrier between you and the speaker, naturally. You don't know the speaker doesn't know you. Therefore, you are rather politely listening, curious as to what the devil he is talking about, and hoping you will get something out of it after sitting an hour or so in this hot tent, expecting something, curious, choosing what suits you, what doesn't suit you, listening partially, not entirely, because one doesn't want to expose oneself to oneself. So naturally, one creates either a very, very thin barrier, hardly any, or a definite wall. Why do we do that? Is that not self-interest? And this self-interest must inevitably bring about fragmentation, to break up. Nationally, you can see the barrier. On one side, England, the other side, all Europe and beyond it. There is this constant division. And where there is division, there must be conflict. That is inevitable. Whether you have a very deep, intimate relationship with your wife or husband, a girl or boy, and so on, where there is division, there must be fragmentation. There must be conflict. That is a law, right? Whether you like it or not, that is a law. But when one sees that, then the very seeing is the way of breaking down the barrier. So now, let's see how this principle operates in connection with our three issues of attachment, comparison, and identification. If I'm attached to someone, it means in very simple terms that I want to keep that person, I want to keep a relationship with that person. It becomes very important to keep that person in my life, and therefore I feel threatened and fearful and jealous in a sense of loss if that person leaves me or develops a relationship with someone else. And so now the attachment does not feel to me like division. It feels to me like, I want a sense of oneness. I want a sense of wholeness. But the person I'm attached to probably doesn't experience it that way. That person probably feels, or may feel, a little bit controlled and possessed, and maybe subtly manipulated, or maybe very obviously manipulated. So in the very process of seeking oneness and togetherness with that person, I'm actually creating a division in my relationship, and that division leads to conflict because I'll be hurt and angry and jealous. And so I'll create the very conditions that will produce the opposite effect of what I want to achieve with my attachment. But attachment is such a pervasive and important part of relationship that I'm not going to say anything more about it now, but bring it up again a little bit later in my talk and go into it more deeply. So now let's look at what happens with another common phenomenon, and that is the process of comparison. If you observe, you can see that that comparison is something that goes on all the time. We compare one person with another, or we compare ourselves with someone who we admire, and we do this so frequently and kind of reflexively that we think of it as a normal thing to do, or even we think it's a worthwhile and admirable thing to do. And in a sense, you could ask, how am I to know or judge whether I or my life is a worthwhile thing to do unless I measure it, compare it with someone? And what better standard can there be than some person that I know and admire, or maybe someone that I've seen on TV that I've formed some kind of idea of? Isn't comparison with some model or ideal a perfectly reasonable way to know whether or not I'm living a good and worthwhile life? Well, Krishnamurti says no. He says, in fact, the process of comparison is counterproductive and destructive and even cruel. He says, in order to compare, you have to form an image of yourself and an image of that other person, and these images are always partial and fragmentary, and they can never capture the whole living human being. And also, when you compare, you're trying to achieve some standard, some value or ideal quality or characteristic. And society regards this as a very good and worthwhile process. We admire the person who we think is idealistic. That's considered a virtue, to be idealistic. But Krishnamurti maintains that ideals are actually very destructive things because they create conflict with what you actually are. And that conflict is a waste of energy, and it prevents you from coming into contact with whatever it is that you actually are. And so the gap between what you are and what the ideal is a division. And where there is division, there must be conflict. So a life based on comparison is based on ideals, which is a form of division and inevitably leads to conflict and disorder. And I think we can see, a similar process of image making and division when it comes to the issue of identification. The psychological process of identification is again something that is very common and very familiar, and it's something that almost everyone engages in. And identification occurs whenever I identify myself with some, could be religious affiliation or a national group, or it could be my nationality, my ethnic group, it could be my family, my neighborhood. Any of these forms of identification occur when I say I'm a member of that group, but what that requires is that I form an image of myself, and I say that image belongs to that group. I identify it with it. And the problem with that is that in that process, I'm separating myself from everybody who's not in the group. And so there's a form of division there which divides me from the rest of humanity. And in modern society, this kind of identification is not only taken for granted, but again, it's considered very admirable. We admire and think it's kind of virtuous if someone is very strongly identified with their nationality or with their family. We think, wow, what a good person to feel that way. But we don't recognize the destructive element of it, unless we see it in some far distant place. For example, if we see that behavior of identification in our enemy in a war, then we can see it's destructive over there. But when it occurs, in our own backyard, it seems normal or even admirable. So now we've talked a little bit about attachment and comparison and identification. And I think that if we put all these things together and try to distill what are the essential features of Krishnamurti's view of the sources of conflict in relationship, it seems to be that what he's saying is that most of us, most of the time, are not really engaged in full actual relationship with people. What happens instead is that we form an image of someone almost as soon as we meet them, or very soon thereafter, and then that image becomes part of the basis for the relationship, because we don't entirely see the actual person. We see them through the filter of the image that we've formed, which is based upon the past, based upon some memory or knowledge. And this may seem a little bit obvious, but I think I should point out that when Krishnamurti talks about an image, he doesn't just mean a visual image. You know, the way he uses that word, we could just as well say we form a concept of a person. And any concept that we have about anything, a concept of marriage, or you could say the concept of like the Queen of England, any concept of that kind is a complex mixture of ideas and memories and associations, and it may include a visual image, but it's not limited to that at all. So all of that is mixed up together in Krishnamurti's use of the word image, and you could just as well say we form a concept of almost everyone we meet, and then we see the person and interact with them through the filter of that concept, which is based on the past. And according to Krishnamurti, this operation of the mind leads inevitably to conflict, because that image that we form is fragmentary. It itself is a fragment. It comes from the past, and there's a division between that image and the actual person that we're related to. And, you know, Krishnamurti's law says where there's division, there must be conflict. It's inevitable. So that's the basic setup, as I understand it, of Krishnamurti's view of the issues or problems that arise in human relationship. And so I'd just like to say a couple things about that. One is that if I were to try to offer some kind of critique of that point of view, what I would point out is this. You know, to some extent, we can agree with what Krishnamurti is saying. You know, it's pretty clear that if I form an image or concept of someone, and that image is in operation while I'm in relationship, it's going to form a filter, and it's going to shape or distort my perception of the actual person. And it's also pretty clear that we do form such images or concepts of almost everyone we know. But to me, the difficulty which arises is that when that image is actually in operation in relationship with someone, we don't see it as an image. That's where the trouble comes in. It doesn't, you know, come with a little label attached, this is an image. On the contrary, you know, that the whole trouble is that we see the image as the actual person. To us, it seems like we're not looking at an image. It seems like we're looking at the actual living person. And so to make that distinction, to see the difference between the person and the image, seems to be where the difficulty comes in kind of seeing Krishnamurti's philosophy in action as it's really actually taking place. Okay, so now there's another important element of Krishnamurti's philosophy that we haven't gone into yet, and that revolves around what I would call his methodology. Because everything we've discussed so far has to do with, you know, the substance or the content of his description of consciousness and of relationship. But there's also the question of method, which means, you know, what are we supposed to do about the problems that he's described? You know, you could say, suppose I agree with Krishnamurti's diagnosis of the sources of conflict in relationship, then, what is his prescription for a solution? What method or procedure or remedy does he recommend to end or eliminate these problems? And so, those of you who are already familiar with Krishnamurti's philosophy probably realize that one of his essential points is there is no method, there is no system, there is no set of steps or procedures that you can take to eliminate these problems or overcome them. According to Krishnamurti, the only solution lies in seeing and perception and the actual observation of oneself. But even though he rejects any method, there is a certain kind of process that Krishnamurti allows that is conducive to perception or understanding. And I think in this broader sense, we can use the word methodology to describe what he has in mind, because even though he rejects methods or systems, he does allow what he calls a kind of approach to questions or problems. And for example, he says that the solution to a question lies in the question. So therefore, if you have a question, you don't look outside the question and seek an answer. Rather, you hold the question in your mind and observe the question and let the question kind of answer itself for you. And more broadly, Krishnamurti allows a methodology which consists of a process of inquiry, which is a matter of seeing and moving from insight to insight and penetrating more and more deeply into a topic or problem. And this is a difficult process to describe abstractly. And so as an alternative, I'm going to give you an example of the way this process functions in Krishnamurti's teachings. And this example also happens to relate to the issue of attachment. So we'll bring those two things together. Because Krishnamurti gave a wonderful illustration of this process of inquiry in one of his public talks at Rockwood Park in England in 1977. And that portion of one of his talks was brought out as a little pamphlet called A Dialogue with Oneself. And I'd like to read this to you to illustrate, both Krishnamurti's methodology of inquiry and also his substantive views on the issue of attachment, because that's so important in understanding human relationship. So it's going to take me 8 or 10 minutes to read this to you. I hope you don't mind my reading so long, but I think it's worth it because it's really a beautiful illustration of some, essential things in the teachings. So, this excerpt is really, it's the last half of a question and answer meeting that occurred, at this talk at Rockwood Park. And if you ever have a chance to listen to the whole thing, it's interesting because at the beginning of this question and answer session, Krishnamurti is kind of uncertain as to how to proceed. He usually has a pretty definite idea as to, whether he's going to take some questions or have some kind of dialogue. But on this particular day, he's rather uncertain, and he asks the audience. He says, what shall we do today? Shall we have a dialogue? Shall we do question and answer? He said, shall I just talk with one or two of you? Shall I invite half a dozen of you up to the platform here and have a dialogue together? And And he and the audience, they go back and forth on this for 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes trying to figure out what procedure they're going to adopt. And finally they get going in various ways, and about halfway through, Krishnamurti resolves to that he kind of gives up on the idea of question and answer and dialogue with anyone. He says, I'm just going to have a dialogue with myself. And that's how this all comes about. And the opening line is, I realize that love cannot exist when there is jealousy. And that too does not just come out of the blue. It's something that they've been discussing in this meeting for quite some time and coming at it from various angles, but none of it satisfies him. So finally he says, I'm just going to have a dialogue with myself, and then he dives into it from that point. He says, I realize that love cannot exist when there is jealousy. Love cannot exist when there is attachment. Now, is it possible for me to be free of jealousy and attachment? I realize that I do not love. That is a fact. I'm not going to deceive myself. I'm not going to pretend to my wife that I love her. I do not know what love is, but I do know that I'm jealous, and I do know that I'm terribly attached to her, and that in attachment there is fear, there is jealousy, anxiety, and there's a sense of dependence. I do not like to depend, but I depend because I'm lonely. I'm shoved around in the office, in the factory, and I come home, and I want to feel comfort and companionship to escape from myself. Now, I ask myself, how am I to be free of this attachment? And he says, I'm just taking that as an example. At first, I want to run away from the question. I do not know how it is going to end up with my wife. When I'm really detached from her, my relationship to her may change. She might be attached to me, and I might not be attached to her or to any other woman. But I'm going to investigate. So I will not run away from what I imagine might be the consequence of being totally free of all attachment. I do not know what love is, but I see very clearly, definitely, without any doubt, that attachment to my wife means jealousy, possession, fear, anxiety, and I want freedom from all that. So I begin to inquire. I look for a method, and I get caught in a system. Some guru says, I will help you to be detached. Do this and this. Practice this and this. I accept what he says because I see the importance of being free, and he promises me that if I do what he says, I will have reward. But I see that way that I'm looking for a reward. I see how silly I am, wanting to be free and getting attached to a reward. So I ask myself, what am I to do to be free of attachment? And what is my motive in wanting to be free of attachment? Is it not that I want to achieve a state where there is no attachment, no fear, and so on? And I suddenly realize that motive gives direction, and that direction will dictate my freedom. Why have a motive? What is motive? A motive is a hope or a desire to achieve something. I see that I am attached to a motive. Not only my wife, not only my idea, the method, but my motive has become my attachment. So I'm all the time functioning within the field of attachment. The wife, the method, and the motive to achieve something in the future, to all this I am attached. I see that it is a tremendously complex thing. I did not realize that to be free of attachment implied all this. Now, I see this as clearly as I see on a map the main roads, the side roads, and the villages. I see it very, very clearly. Then I say to myself, now, is it possible for me to be free of the great attachment I have for my wife, and also of the reward which I think I'm going to get, and of my motive? To all this I am attached. Why? Is it that I am insufficient in myself? Is it that I am very, very lonely and therefore seek to escape from that feeling of isolation by turning to a woman, an idea, a motive, as if I must hold on to something? I see that it is so. I am lonely and escaping through attachment to something from that feeling of extraordinary isolation. So I'm interested in understanding why I am lonely, for I see it as that which makes me attached. That loneliness has forced me to escape through attachment to this or to that, and I see as long as I'm lonely, the sequence will always be this. What does it mean to be lonely? How does it come about? Is it instinctual, inherited, or is it brought about by my daily activity? If it's an instinct, it is inherited as part of my lot. I'm not to blame. But I do not accept this. I question it and remain with the question. I am watching, and I'm not trying to find an intellectual answer. I'm not trying to tell the loneliness what it should do or what it is. I'm watching for it to tell me. There is a watchfulness for the loneliness to reveal itself. It will not reveal itself if I run away, if I'm frightened, if I resist it. So I watch it. I watch it so that no thought interferes. Watching is much more important than thought coming in. And because my whole energy is concerned with the observation of that loneliness, thought does not come in at all. The mind is being challenged, and it must answer. Being challenged, it is in a crisis. This is a challenge which must be answered. So there is this tremendous energy to answer the question, why is there this loneliness? I've rejected ideas, suppositions, and theories. All that means nothing to me. Loneliness is what is. Why is there this loneliness which every human being must go through? Why does it come into being? Is it that the mind is doing something which is bringing it about? I've rejected theories as to instinct and inheritance, and I'm asking, is the mind, the brain itself, bringing about this loneliness, this total isolation? Is the movement of thought doing this? Is the thought in my daily life creating this sense of isolation? In the office, I'm isolating myself because I want to become the top executive. Therefore, thought is working all the time, isolating itself. I see that thought is all the time operating to make itself superior. The mind is working itself towards its own isolation. So the problem then is, why does thought do this? Is it the nature of thought to work for itself? Education brings about this isolation. It gives me a certain career, a certain specialization, and so on, isolation. Thought, being fragmentary, being limited and time-binding, is creating this isolation. In that limitation, it has found security, saying, I have a special career in my life. I am a professor. I am perfectly safe. So my concern is then, why does thought do it? Is it in its very nature to do this? Whatever thought does must be limited. Now the problem is, can thought realize that whatever it does is limited, fragmented, and therefore isolating, and that whatever it does will be thus? This is a very important point. Can thought itself realize its own limitations? Or am I telling it that it is limited? This, I see, is very important to understand. This is the real essence of the matter. If thought realizes itself that it is limited, then there is no resistance, no conflict. It says, I am that. But if I am telling it that it is limited, then I become separate from the limitation. Then I struggle to overcome the limitation. Therefore, there is conflict and violence, not love. So there has been in my conversation with myself the discovery that loneliness is created by thought. Thought has now realized of itself that it is limited and so cannot solve the problem of loneliness. And it cannot solve the problem of loneliness. Does loneliness exist? Thought has created this sense of loneliness, this emptiness, because it is limited, fragmentary, divided. And when it realizes this, loneliness is not. Therefore, there is freedom from attachment. I have done nothing. I have watched the attachment, what is implied in it, greed, fear, loneliness, all that, and by tracing it, observing it, not analyzing it, but just looking, and looking, there is the discovery that thought has done all this. Thought, because it is fragmentary, has created this attachment. When it realizes this, attachment ceases. There is no effort made at all. For the moment there is effort, conflict is back again. So, through negation of what is not love, love is. I do not have to ask what love is. I do not have to run after it. If I run after it, it is not love. It is a reward. So I have negated, I have ended in that inquiry, slowly, carefully, without distortion, without illusion, everything that it is not. The other is. So, I'd like to offer a few observations about this dialogue. The point of departure is the speaker realizes that where there is attachment, there is no love. He sees that attachment is an impediment to love. And from that, he begins to inquire inwardly into the sources of the attachment. And, that approach is good. It's fine for purposes of this dialogue. But we should also recognize that when we experience a problem with attachment, it usually comes about in a different way. Normally we become aware that we're attached and the attachment is creating a problem when the person we're attached to is doing something that threatens our need to be secure. If it is a woman, she might start flirting with another man, or she might not be answering my text messages, or I might think that she's not being honest with me about something. And in these cases, my attachment is not drawn inwardly to find out the sources of my attachment. On the contrary, my attention is drawn very, very strongly outwardly, toward what I perceive as the problem in that woman's behavior. And at that moment, the last thing in the world I want to do is look inwardly at the sources of my attachment. I just want to fix the problem with that woman. And so more generally, this is one of the challenges of Krishnamurti's whole philosophy, because he demands that we look inwardly and understand ourselves, whereas the issues he deals with, such as anger and fear and jealousy, they very often present themselves to us in such a way that we are consumed with looking outwardly and not to explore inwardly as his teaching requires. And the second point I want to make about the dialogue is the issue that arises when he asks whether thought itself can understand or realize its own limitations. This, I think, is a very crucial issue in the whole of Krishnamurti's teachings, whether thought can be aware of itself and understand its own nature, see its own limitations. And it's a question that I personally find very puzzling, but it seems to go right to the root of the teachings. And so I just want to highlight it for your consideration as a very important but a very puzzling point. And finally, I want to come back to the question of Krishnamurti's methodology, which entails no method, no system, no practice, but instead what is important in his approach is perception, seeing something for oneself, or having an insight. And one of the characteristics of this kind of seeing or insight is that it does not involve time. It's not something that evolves, the way species evolve through time, or, the way that, if you want to learn a language or learn to play the piano is something that requires, weeks or months or years to practice. And in fact, Krishnamurti maintains that in the psychological field, there is no such thing as time at all. Of course, he acknowledges chronological time, ordinary time that we measure with a clock or a calendar, but he maintains that psychologically, there is no time, and the process of evolving or becoming something better through psychological time does not exist. There is no psychological evolution, and this is a very important point in the teachings, and it distinguishes his approach from almost everybody else who has anything to say in the psychological field. So just to wrap up and conclude, I want to make one more point, come back to something that I said at the very beginning, which is that, Krishnamurti has said relationship is with people, things, and ideas, but he doesn't include nature in that list. And this is puzzling because relationship with nature was very important in his life. And he sometimes said, if you have no relationship with nature, how can you have relationship with human beings? And he didn't really go into this question or explore it very deeply. He simply raised it and kind of left it for people to consider. But he did bring nature into the teachings in another way, because in several of his books, in the commentaries on living and in his diaries, Krishnamurti's notebook and the other diaries, he has frequently very, very vivid descriptions, scenes from nature that he remembers with amazing clarity. And usually he just presents these and then moves into a discussion of some people who came to visit him or some observations about consciousness. And so there's just a certain juxtaposition between the two, and that contrast is very interesting, and some things that he's written. And so in a similar spirit, I'd like to end by reading one of his descriptions of a scene from nature. And for this purpose, I looked at a lot of these descriptions that he has in his books. And I found one where he does kind of juxtapose a description of something in nature with a description of a person that he encountered, and it kind of, I think, helps illustrate this theme of if you have relationship with nature, then you can have relationship with a person. So this is from Krishnamurti's journal. This is from October 6th, 1973. There is a single tree in a green field that occupies a whole acre. It is old and highly respected by all the other trees on the hill. In its solitude, it dominates the noisy stream, the hills, and the cottage across the wooden bridge. You admire it as you pass it by, but on your return, you look at it in a more leisurely way. Its trunk is very large, deeply embedded in the earth, solid and indestructible. Its branches are long, dark, and curving. It has rich shadows. In the evening, it is withdrawn into itself, unapproachable. But during the daylight hours, it is open and welcoming. It is whole, untouched by an axe or saw. On a sunny day, you sat under it. You felt its venerable age, and because you were alone with it, you were aware of the depth and the beauty of life. The old villager wearily passed you by as you were sitting on a bridge looking at the sunset. He was almost blind, limping, carrying a bundle in one hand and in the other a stick. It was one of those evenings when the colors of the sunset were on every rock, tree, and bush. The grass and the fields seemed to have their own inner light. The sun had set behind a rounded hill, and amidst these extravagant colors, there was the birth of the evening star. The villager stopped in front of you, looked at those startling colors and at you. You looked at each other, and without a word, he trudged on. In that communication, there was affection, tenderness, and respect. Not the silly respect, but that of religious men. At that moment, all time and thought had come to an end. You and he were utterly religious, uncorrupted by belief, image, by word, or poverty. You often passed each other on that road, among the stony hills, And each time, as you looked at one another, there was the joy of total insight. So, I think, can we take a break for 10 minutes and then come back and talk? Because we haven't, I think until 1 o'clock is when lunch. Okay, so we'll just take a short break, 10 or like 15 minutes at the most.